So is it ever okay for the government to prevent us from publishing things? Let's take a look. What we're talking about is prior restraint, and this is basically the government insisting on giving prior approval to something before it's going to be printed or broadcasted. And as you can guess, that kind of flies in the face of the First Amendment. And because of that, the court's view to this point has been it's really the most serious and the least tolerable infringement we can have on the First Amendment. And many of these attempts are prevented, but not all of them. The rules of the road of prior restraint are that it's assumed to be unconstitutional unless the government can prove with a very high burden that this is the only way that it can achieve whatever it needs to achieve in terms of national security or whatever the reason is why it's insisting on having prior restraint. Then the scope has to be very narrow so that it's not, as we've talked about before, overbroad. Now, there are certain things that by their very nature do not have First Amendment protection, and so prior restraint doesn't really become an issue. One would be child pornography, obscenity. The court really doesn't have a very difficult time preventing those things from being published because they lack protection. Now, some examples of where we've seen prior restraint, you may not even think about it, I've listed them here. One in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune versus the Minneapolis Commission of Revenue. They actually put a tax on paper and ink products, and of course, who uses paper and ink but printers? So by putting that tax on there, that was deemed to be a prior restraint. There was also, in the Hornstein versus Hartigan case, we had a statute that required a licensee to advertise in a specific law enforcement publication. That was considered to be prior restraint. And then an ordinance that banned news racks in residential areas in the Chicago Newspaper Publishers Association versus the City of Wheaton was also deemed to be prior restraint. Now, I'm sure you can guess why this was such a big problem for the Founding Fathers and for early Americans, because they came from a country where prior restraint was a pretty well accepted practice. Every press, of course, in England was licensed. We actually have licensure all around the world with the exception of the United States. And the one thing that the framers really wanted to prevent was this idea that the government could get in the way of publishing things, especially things that were critical of the government. Next, we're going to take a look at some of the cases that have helped to shape prior restraint.